Hi, I'm Susan Matthews. Welcome to the Subverse, where we journey from the complexity of development to the art of resistance, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining futures. In this episode, we talk about fossil fuels, climate change, and energy transitions. We speak with Ketan Joshi, a prolific writer, analyst, and communications consultant focusing on clean energy and climate change. He's based in Oslo and is the author of Windfall, Unlocking a Fossil-Free Future. I came across Ketan's work in the past 2 years, and I have really gained from his rigorous data analysis and commentary on these crucially important topics. The evolution of energy has changed both human and natural history in significant ways. Energy is not a neutral input, and cheap, energy-rich fossil fuels are a key aspect of the fabric of our social universe. Dipesh Chakrabarty, an Indian historian and post-colonial thinker, once wrote, "The mansion of modern freedom stands on an ever-expanding base of fossil fuel use, and most of our freedoms are energy-intensive." So for me, the question is not whether renewables can replace fossil fuels, but what kind of a world do we transition into, which is not driven by an unconscious use of energy? Ketan and I had a great conversation around a range of topics, from the impact of fossil fuels on climate change, the role of the fossil fuel industry, the rise of renewables, and the impacts of both on land and culture. We spoke of the need for energy justice as a bedrock for action and policy in these areas, along with a broader view of the drivers of ecological collapse. Hi, Ketan. Welcome to the Subverse.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's very nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. In fact, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I think, given the news in the last couple of weeks with extreme weather events all over the world, with the COP26 coming up in Glasgow very soon, and the new IPCC report, well, at least its early chapters, signaling a code red for humanity, it feels very timely to have this discussion.
It does. It's been a busy few weeks actually. I was just yesterday looking at a tracking project that looks at media coverage of climate change and global warming. Those two phrases, how often they're mentioned in global media coverage. August 2021 was the highest number of mentions of climate change since 2009, December 2009, at least according to this one. And I find that really indicative of where we're at now. Of course, I think that November this year, COP26 coming up, it's probably going to be even higher than that. But as you say, the onset of a lot of really severe and serious natural disasters, and then also the release of the IPCC report, those two together, it's actually really starting to get back onto people's radars now.
Thank you. And I know that in this conversation, we're going to cover some of these things more in depth, but I'm sort of curious about your own background. I have read a lot of your writing on renewable energy and climate change since I came across it. And I've learned a lot from your work. So thank you for that. So I'm curious, what brought you into this field? What's the background that led you here? And you could also tell us about your book, Windfall, which was published in September 2020.
Yeah, it was funny looking at all my little, 1 year ago memories, because it's all my little bits and pieces that I did promoting the book when it came out this time last year. But I'll sort of rewind a little bit to the start of my career. I actually did a science degree back in Sydney in Australia. I finished that and I didn't really know what to do with myself. I think a lot of people who finish science degrees end up in this situation where they're just sort of like, oh, look, I like science, but I don't really know how I like science or what to do. And so I started applying for a bunch of jobs. I didn't actually have any particular interest in renewable energy or even climate change, to be honest. I started applying for jobs that had a data analytics component and sort of you could use a science background to get into. And this job came up in a wind farm monitoring center actually in Sydney. And I started doing like data analysis, monitoring these wind farms, doing dispatch and maintenance and things like that. It was really, really interesting. But I immediately, as soon as I started that job, I discovered that renewable energy was suddenly becoming like this forefront for this really hot political debate in Australia, not just in the policy sense, but also in the sort of community and cultural sense. People were responding to the presence of development, of wind farm developments in their community and things like that. that really took my interest straight away. And I started blogging. I started doing some writing, not on behalf of the company, but just on like my own Twitter page in sort of 2013 and on my own blog. And I really wanted to explore those two issues. So one being the community side and the other being the political side, the sort of more policy side of it. And I've kind of followed that trajectory ever since, to be honest, not necessarily with renewable energy. I left that sector in sort of 2016, 2017. Of course, I have still have a strong interest in it. Now I'm much more interested in more general issues around the fossil fuel industry, issues around development. So not just renewables, but of course, every piece of technology or every machinery or every sort of natural, sort of nature-based solution for climate change, all of those things, I sort of try and see them through the lens of where I began, which is community and policy, those two lenses. And so it's really informed how I've thought about all these things over the years. And Windfall, I wanted to put together a wrap up of my 10 years. I began in that job in 2010, and I thought, okay, well, it's 2020 now. Let's try and package it all together. And everything that I've learned, I wanted to try and get it into a sort of a story, a single story. It really seemed to revolve around energy justice. And so when it comes down to things like the development of wind farms in Australia, I think a lot of people didn't realize that was probably like the first big energy justice story in Australia, an energy transition story, I should say, because of course there have been many energy justice stories in Australia predating renewables, particularly around fossil fuel extraction and things like that. But I wanted to basically frame it in that way and say, look, there was a lot of antagonism towards wind farm development in Australia, particularly from the communities that were sort of nearby to them, but also from political parties and sort of vested interests in the fossil fuel industry and things like that. And they all kind of were understood a little bit too simply, I thought, during the time. I think people kind of had this, they were like, oh, okay, well, if you hate wind farms, then you're a fossil fuel supporter or something like that. And I thought, let's kind of problematize that a bit, let's complicate it, because it's actually really important to understand it. And if you misdiagnose why people didn't like those things that were happening, then you're just going to continue making the same mistake forever. And so that's what Windfall was about. And I wrap it all up with more of a policy focus, because I wanted to also think about the distinction or the delineation between individual responsibility, collective and community action. I don't end on a positive note in the book, but of course I try and end on a angry and urging action kind of note, because I think there's a lot of things that can be done to try and counter that. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
That's a fascinating background, Ketan. One thing you alluded to in the conversation, and I've read a lot of your articles on this, which is kind of the recalcitrance and resistance by fossil fuel industry in terms of making, let's say, big changes. What has been your experience in terms of the fossil fuel industry in this regard?
I'll try and keep my answer brief, because I think I could talk for like a day on this. Maybe I'll give you the answer with a specific example, because it kind of contains it all, and that's Shell. Shell really, it feels like they care the most about their image of all the fossil fuel companies. They're the most anxious about how they're perceived, how they look. Earlier this year, there was a court case against Shell in a Dutch court. And what had happened is Shell had said, look, we're acting on climate change. We've got this plan. We've got a net zero target by 2050, and we've got a plan, in the short term to 2030 to deal with our emissions in this particular way. And the court examined it and said, look, you're actually not changing your emissions at all. Using the numbers that you've presented here, you're actually just going to continue selling the same volume of fossil fuels. You might sort of reduce the emissions from extracting the fossil fuels slightly, but when it comes down to it, that's fundamentally not really changing much at all, because those products, when they're purchased, they're still burned. And when that burning process happens, they cause climate change. And so the court said to Shell, well, actually, you just need to stop selling fossil fuels. I read the finding, and it's just beautiful how simple it is, because they're just like, no one's actually forcing you to sell oil and gas. Like, you can sell something else instead if you want to. Of course, the idea behind what they say is that they're selling a substance that's required for the functioning of human society, of human life. And there's no alternative. You just have to continue selling it. And you can only reduce its consumption very, very, very slowly. And most of that lies on the sort of moral burden of the consumer. Me going to a petrol station and pouring a sort of tank full of petrol into a car. It's my responsibility, not the responsibility of the company that puts the petroleum into that station so that I can use it. This is how they delay action, right? They sort of present two arguments at the same time. So first of all, they're saying that they have no responsibility. They're sort of passive. They're sort of sitting back and they're just there saying, well, look, you're the ones demanding these fossil fuels from us, so we can't really do much to change it. But then on the other hand, they actually are very, very active when it comes to altering demand itself. So historically, they'll do things like opposing policies that would lead to a reduction in demand for fossil fuels. Like, actually, just to jump to another company as an example, ExxonMobil is a good one because they were recently revealed in sort of a secret recording to have admitted to attacking climate solutions, right? So renewable energy, they sort of frame that as like a threat to society. It won't power society. You'll have blackouts and you'll have really high electricity prices. And they're doing that not because they have genuine concerns about how renewable energy is rolled out, of which there are some, but they're doing it in bad faith because they want to protect the sale of fossil gas to power stations, which is something that they sell. The reason that we're seeing what we're seeing, which is basically none of these companies actually want to change the stuff that they sell, is because it's really hard to do that. It costs them money to do that. They're probably going to lose some money as they change from being suppliers of fossil fuels to suppliers of something else, or to suppliers of nothing at all, and shrinking into like just evaporating into nothingness because they define themselves by this common ground, which is that we dig up and we supply fossil fuels. And this is actually a really deep and existential thing for them. You can sort of think about that in the sense of their profit motive, that they're driven by profits solely. I think that's a valid way of looking at it. But I think that the other thing on top of it is a bit more sort of deeper and existential and more linked to identity, which is that they really just can't imagine themselves doing anything else. It's how they see themselves as human beings. And that makes it a lot more complicated when it comes to trying to pressure them to do something else, because you're sort of saying to them, like, well, you need to actually change who you are as people. You're not extractors of fossil fuel anymore. But I think that's partly why a lot of state-owned organizations also kind of have the same problem, even though they may not feel the same sort of like investor pressures or shareholder pressures. In fact, in many cases, they're often a lot worse, the state-owned enterprises. That's kind of a bit of a whirlwind tour of the past year. But I've been doing a bit of writing for this group called the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, who I really like, and they just kind of let me write whatever I want, which is fantastic.
It was a fascinating whirlwind tour, I have to say. I've been doing quite a bit of reading from the energy humanities. And there's some really fascinating kind of commentators who have spoken about our addiction to fossil fuel and our dependence. One thing that I read that really struck with me is that energy is not a neutral input. So we see it purely as an input that then drives our economies or drives our societies, but it's not purely neutral. It's a sort of a key aspect of our social fabric, the way we live, our social condition. Ever since we had fossil fuels and they were cheap and they were energy rich, it has also meant that we then learn to live a certain way, whether it's our behavior, what we spend on, the way we move, everything. And as one author pointed out, it's like we're saturated with fossil fuels in a way. It's so deeply embedded in our lives. And so I think when you talk about it being quite existential, I think it's not so far from the truth. It's almost like it's difficult to imagine a world without this dependence. The dependence actually has gone so deep that, as one person put it, it's sort of hiding in plain sight. And I was just curious to hear your views on this.
Yeah, I was listening to a really fantastic podcast actually yesterday about the history of the car itself. So not the combustion engine, but the sort of device of a 2 meter long or 3 meter long box with wheels on it that takes you around, right? And of course, originally it was pulled around by horses, and the combustion engine was sort of introduced as a way of dealing with a pollution problem, which was horse manure. Horse manure was such a severe pollution problem that they sort of brought the combustion engine, and they were like, oh, thank God, we don't have to deal with any of this horse poo being flung around the streets and like sort of spattering the clothes of like Victorians. So the amount of energy stored in the device itself, the amount of energy in a tank of petrol is much higher than the sort of stored energy in a horse, right? Or two horses. And that increase in the amount of energy that's being carried around resulted in a very, very significant change to the way cities were designed. It's not just neutral, the energy wasn't just there, it actually began to change the world around it. And I found that really interesting because, of course, I live in Oslo, and Norway has one of the highest shares of electric vehicle sales, of like new car sales in the world. And they sort of started a couple of decades ago, with like incentives for electric vehicles. And so it actually raises this really interesting question of, when you change the type of energy, what else are you changing about the world around you? A lot of thinkers on this can be a bit narrow, myself included, because I don't, I don't always sort of introspect about what I'm writing or thinking about. But when I do, I realize that I actually suffer the same problem, which is that you sort of start to think of energy as like this really neutral thing and all that matters is greenhouse gas emissions footprint that came in its lifespan. But then you actually start to realize something like, streets are still designed to accommodate vehicles. A large private vehicle with 5 seats here in Oslo, there are some pretty good bike lanes, but it's still a car city. When I'm walking with my kid out on a road, I still feel scared. I don't drive a car regularly. We only use like sort of car hire or car share, and I ride a bike most of the time. And I feel scared when I'm riding a bike most of the time. The instantaneous power draw from an electric motor is far greater than the power draw from my leg, when I'm on a bicycle. And so that mismatch between energy availability still has an impact on my state, my sort of level of comfort and fear. It's actually a really nice, healthy reminder sometimes to keep that in mind. What you said about energy not being a neutral or sort of blank slate kind of resource for society.
We'll be back after a break. I'd like to speak a little bit more about energy transitions. And before I think we speak more in terms about the future, I wanted to go back to the past a little bit. It hits on certain things that you mentioned in the beginning. When you spoke about the history of the car, I was thinking about the history of energy, overall. And clearly that history is very important because it's that history which has changed human history and natural history quite dramatically. And here I wanted to go back in a way to kind of colonial rule and colonial machineries. Energy was very, very important for the colonial machinery. That's what entailed its smooth functioning. One thing that I do feel is that when we had independence, especially in countries like India, we, in a way, continued our path dependencies in terms of energy. It didn't change. We chose extractivist models, in terms of how we then dealt with energy even after independence. And I'm just sort of curious to hear your views on this topic.
Yeah, the first example that springs to mind actually is less to do with history and more to do with nationalism in energy, because this is something I've been trying to pay attention to, trying to sort of focus on. I find it so worrying that we don't have a particularly good level of discourse around how nationalism and, with a country like Australia, of course, by proxy, colonialism plays very much heavily into that. Because of course, Australia has very rich fossil fuel resources, right? Like underground, it's got a lot of coal and it's got a lot of gas. And of course, many of the areas in which coal and gas mining occurs are indigenous lands. And they're done in extremely, sort of callous and cruel ways in the past. And actually, uranium extraction too. That has wound down a lot over the past few decades, but a lot of uranium mines had exactly the same problem. Now, I think people can recognize that to some degree. They can look back on that and say, okay, this is obviously not a good thing and it needs to change. But what I think people have a lot of difficulty in dealing with is recognizing that those same problems might be replicated again in the future for different modes of extraction. And so energy extraction techniques, not digging stuff out of the ground, but basically planting machinery onto the ground, consume some level of land, right? So and using land to plant organic life that will, photosynthesize and can take carbon out of the air. That also requires land. And so these two different types of climate solutions actually have the same risk embedded into them in that they need land. And land has been a really huge problem in the past I know I keep coming back to Australia, but it's sort of where I grew up and learned a lot about these things. But it's the same conflicts starting to happen over and over again. And the problem, of course, is that there is still not a wide understanding of the historical inequities and injustice that occurred when it comes to fossil fuel energy. And I think that actually there needs to be a much better understanding of this when it comes to newer forms of energy like sunlight and wind, and biomass in particular. This is really something that I think is going to ramp up a lot in Australia. When you look at how climate action is often framed in Australia, they'll say stuff like, we want to be a superpower of renewables, right? Like we want to continue the same thing, right? It's not just winding down the fossil fuel industry. Actually, what we want to do is use wind and solar to produce hydrogen in the form of ammonia and put it on a boat and sell it to other countries, because we want to continue being a powerful country that uses its resources and sells it to the world, and it'll be fine, because these things don't have carbon emissions. So we get to keep our position as a superpower, as this great nation, but we don't have to worry about the ethical problems because there are no carbon emissions. And it's well, of course, as we said earlier, energy is its own thing. It has its own politics. It has its own impact on society. It changes the world around it, right? The extraction process, the transport process, and the usage process, they all transform society. And so you can't just kind of forget about, what it actually means to be a superpower. Even if it's a clean energy superpower, it actually is a very, very meaningful thing for the communities around the facilities that you need to build and the pipelines and all that sort of stuff. It's really the same problems of racism, of wealth inequality, all those things. They start being replicated again. And it's not because people do try, but it takes really just the same amount of effort that it took in the past to fight against these things. And it's just so hard. There are so many great activists and scholars and climate groups in Australia who are very much aware of what I'm talking about here, but they're really up against pre-existing systems, right? Which is why actually the very worst examples of renewable deployment or really bad offset projects, sort of dodgy, land grabbing kind of stuff, they all actually tend to have links to the fossil fuel industry anyway, right? A good example is actually Adani, right? They have this coal mine in Australia, of course, which is impinging on the rights of so many Indigenous people in the place where that coal mine is being built. But at the same time, they have these huge solar projects, right, in other parts of the world that actually create the same injustices. Not exactly the same, but of course it's the same problem stemming from the same root cause. You sort of hear a lot of people saying it's not enough to deal with carbon emissions, right? You actually have to start addressing these deeper problems. I think people object to that and they don't quite realize what a substantial and serious threat this is, not just to, of course, the fundamental thing is that we need to protect human rights and we need to protect equity. We need to protect life on Earth, right? Not just human life, but the lives of animals and plants and all the things that basically don't have a voice. This was sort of the thrust of the book, Windfall, from last year, is that you need to get it right for two reasons. First of all, it's the right thing to do. Secondly, you're not going to actually get to where you need to be if you disregard issues of justice and equity during the transformation from one type of energy to another type of energy.
It's absolutely fascinating. And you're right. For example, in the case of India, Adani is very much on the forefront of renewable energy projects. And yes, and all this doesn't help in terms of let's say, bringing people into this cause. I think people see the usual suspects of fossil fuels, even within the realm of renewable energy, and that's highly problematic. I was reading recently about the state of renewable energy finance now in India. And you often find that actually, when it comes to the private sector and banks, they will no longer actually lend money for coal, etc. There's still a push for this by national governments and by state governments. So they're the ones putting in money into these kinds of projects. It's not necessarily coming from the private sector. There seems to be kind of different different kinds of pathways which are opening up, some which governments seem to be pushing, and another which is sort of driven by the market. And of course, you also find a lot of reference to kind of more community based projects. And I wonder whether you came across good examples of this projects which are more community driven and which are more democratic in terms of its design. Because I think when we're speaking about these kinds of inequalities and injustice, I'm just curious to see how, let's say, something which is driven from below could maybe differ from something that's driven from above or driven by the private sector.
Yeah, there's actually two things I just want to address there that are worth mentioning. The first, I just want to quickly mention you talked about government intervention for financing for fossil fuel projects. This is actually really important and it relates to the second part of your question. So over the past decade, renewables got quite cheap, right? Like they started out relatively expensive, but because they're small and they're in little units, so you can manufacture lots of them in one big go, renewables got pretty cheap. And this was sort of celebrated. Like a lot of my colleagues, as like renewable energy advocates were like, yeah, fantastic. This is what we always wanted. This is all you need, right? Like you just like, oh, great, they're cheap now. You can just kind of let the free market go and the energy transition will happen itself because all it needs to be is cheap. Unfortunately, what is happening is in India, of course, but also in other countries like in the US and in Australia, is that when renewables start to threaten the finances of fossil fuel projects, the government just steps in and says, yeah, okay, well, we'll just give you some subsidies. Like, we gave all these subsidies to renewables, so we're just going to give the subsidies to the coal plants and keep them going. And all of a sudden, the free market plea of like, oh, renewables are cheap now, it just completely goes, right? There's two other side effects of cheap renewables that are really important. And the first one is the size and the speed of projects, right? So because solar in particular is getting like just really dirt cheap, there is actually a hazard that emerges where you can get projects that are just really large and centralized and with not a lot of emotional investment from its proponents, right? So they can just build like a gigawatt in like what they see as like, a sort of featureless desert. But in reality, like that land may be a rich ecosystem, or it could be land that is important to people who need it, who rely on it, or who have a cultural or emotional connection to it. But it's cheap to build solar and you get energy from it and you can sell it. And so that is a hazard that emerges from having cheap solar. But the counter swing of it is that because renewables have become so cheap, it actually opens up a really, really vast number of doors for community owned energy. And so basically, one of the big problems with community energy in the early 2010s was actually just that it was so expensive to build a bunch of renewable energy. Now, because renewables are so cheap, it really changes the dynamics of community energy. You need less subsidies to get community energy projects off the ground. They're a lot more flexible. You can really change the sizes of community owned energy projects. And so I'm actually weirdly optimistic about this because I think that what we will hopefully see is that we're going to see a lot more diversity in the types of energy projects, that there's going to be less of a dichotomy between really small rooftop distributed stuff and very big corporatized centralized renewables. And it's going to open up this huge middle ground where people can either own an actual part of the project, they can invest in it, they can actually treat it like a sort of almost like a car sharing type thing, where you kind of just put some money in to your local community solar farm and then you get some energy back from it at a guaranteed price or something like that. All these different types of models for bottom up renewable projects are starting to emerge thanks to the drop in price. And so you can see how renewables aren't inherently good or bad, right? Like it actually, because they're so distributed, because of the nature of the technology, it actually really matters who builds them, the political environment in which they're built, and also the corporate and community environment in which they're built. And that actually decides what it looks like. Is it good? Is it environmentally sound? Were the minerals used to make those solar panels or wind turbines, do they come from an ethical source where the workers were treated well? All these sorts of questions, they suddenly become design questions rather than inherent arguments about which particular technology you're talking about. I think that there's not a good recognition of just how bad the outcomes would be if we don't fully recognize and call upon the community spirit that already exists, that people want to be connected to energy. They realize that it's not a neutral thing, that it actually is something that is very local and physical and real from the outset. It's not this concept in a model. And so I think that that all really needs to change before we can actually start seeing those changes that we need to see to achieve climate goals. It's probably just worth mentioning the other side of the equation, which is electricity demand. I think it's actually a really similar vibe, basically, that, people actually want control of their own demand in a sense, right? Like they want a bit more connection and awareness, and they're happy to reduce demand. People are really, it's not this whole view of like the more energy someone has, the happier they are. It's ridiculous, right? We're smart people around the world. Like we know how to live good lives without relying on really crazy amounts of energy. And so I think that giving people much more empowerment, much more connection to the way that they consume energy is a really, really good thing. In doing it in like low tech ways can be a really good thing too. Because of course, the less materials that you need to actually make a change like that, the better and the more accessible it is around the world.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I'm curious in terms of something you said right in the beginning, and also to connect with the writing that you're doing these days, Ketan. So, one thing that is clear is that climate discourse or global warming is really just one slice in terms of, let's say, the kinds of problems that we're beset with. And there are so many other drivers of ecological collapse around us. So, how in your work do you now sort of, let's say, connect your own writing around renewable energy and your own thinking around renewable energy, let's say, with these other drivers? We haven't spoken in much depth about it, and you could have an entire podcast episode on mining and minerals that we require for setting up things in relation to renewable energy. I'm just sort of curious, how do you see these connections, and how would that change, in a way, maybe your own approaches in terms of how you write in the future?
Yeah, this is a really tricky thing because I have a background as a data analyst. And so that drives me to focus on single metrics a lot. It's a bad habit, that I'm probably never going to get rid of during my entire life, right? And so there are a lot of things that you can't measure, that are essentially impossible to put into numbers, but that are also massive, massive considerations when it comes to things like energy transformations. And so you brought up mineral requirements, like material needs for the machines that you would need to replace the sort of fossil fuel economy around the world. And I think that those things are really, you can quantify that, right? Like I was reading the International Energy Agency's net zero report, and they've got a little bit in there called critical minerals, and it focuses on like copper and lithium, cobalt, all that sort of stuff. The vast bulk of it goes into electric vehicles in these models. Renewables actually sort of don't take up a huge slice of it. Just the size of the fleet of cars around the world is just so massive that to replace it one for one, you need these things. On a spreadsheet, if you just kind of replace it one for one, you end up with this massive number, right? A huge ramp up of lithium mining and copper mining. There's a few others in there. I actually recommend having a poke around in that IEA report because it gives you a good idea. If you kind of look very narrowly at just replacing the functionality of the thing, then you end up with this huge number. It's kind of scary, right? Because then you look at it and you go, okay, well, that's a lot of new mines. That's a lot of new mines in regions that suffer from problems where those projects are actually very harmful to the environment, to the ecology around those sites. And maybe a nice example is Tesla's Gigafactory in, I think it's just outside of Berlin. There have been pretty strong protests against that Gigafactory because there are some environmental issues around its development. You then have to consider two different pathways, right? One is it possible to do that process in a more environmentally sensitive way? What would that entail? What would that look like? And the second is, do you actually need those materials? Is there a different way that you can basically achieve the needs of the people who, in your model, use a car without actually needing it to purchase an entirely new vehicle? Can you use a cargo bike and use, like a 20th of the materials? Or, well, actually, it would be far less between a cargo bike and a car. Or can you offer different modes of transport? Or can you do car sharing? So, like, you have one vehicle between 30 people or something like that. And so the ecological considerations feed all the way through to right to the end use, and they become reasons to change more than just the engine or the classification of energy, right? Because if you focus narrowly on carbon emissions, then on paper it's easy. You just get rid of the fossil fuels and you just do something else instead. But of course, in reality, if you do that without considering the sort of shifting puzzle that's created when you build an entirely new energy system, then you lose an opportunity to correct a lot of pre-existing harms, and you also lose the opportunity to prevent new harms in the process. The other thing that's worth mentioning when you sort of talk about ecology there is waste. I've been doing a bit of reading and a bit of work on waste. There are just so many parallels with the system of burning fossil fuels and greenhouse gases just kind of being deposited into the atmosphere, and something like plastics, right, which is, actually very closely linked to the process of fossil fuel extraction. But then a similar thing happens, right? We sort of use it once, and then we deposit the unused portion into the world, and just as carbon emissions are deposited into the atmosphere. And so the link to ecology becomes a lot clearer. Like I sort of said before, how I'm a bit single-minded about emissions sometimes. And I try not to be. It's hard to shake the data bit of my mind sometimes. But at the same time, I sort of try and also recognize that there's a lot of really parallel problems going on between the sort of ecological crisis and the climate crisis, to the extent where it's sort of not that much of a dichotomy between them. They have the same impact of, like, when you don't deal with them, vulnerable people get hurt very badly. And people who have been hurt before in the past due to sort of pre-existing societal problems get hurt more when you don't deal with ecological crises or when you don't deal with the climate crisis. Sorry, one more thing that's just worth mentioning too is the degrowth movement, because I think that illustrates a good, fresh way of thinking about things that's provocative, and I really like it. I like the way that it targets the way we sort of bundle ourselves into very specific solutions, and that it actually expands the field outwards a lot more in a very healthy way. I don't like the antagonism towards it. I think that it's a really clever and creative way of basically unboxing ourselves from thinking about how we deal with these dual crises, biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis at the same time.
Thank you, Ketan. In fact, I agree with you on so much of this. I'll let you share any final thoughts that you may have with our listeners. Maybe speak a little bit about your next projects, what's sort of coming up, and anything you would want to say. Thank you.
I have no projects coming up. I'm going on paternity leave, parental leave in a couple of months. So I'm going to disappear off the face of the earth during COP26. But I do recommend going to my Twitter feed, because that's where that's like the central nexus for a lot of the work I do. But also, I recommend this report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that came out a few weeks ago. It looks very daunting. It is daunting. I mean, it's like 3,600 pages or something like that. But there is this summary that you can get on their website called Summary for Policymakers. I actually recommend going and having a look at it if you haven't already. And also, even if you kind of feel like you know the climate science and you kind of get it, it actually has a really interesting message about urgency and how every ton of greenhouse gas that's emitted does damage, right, to the natural world, to living things on Earth, to humans and to human society. And so it actually explains that message in a surprisingly clear and nice way, I thought. And in a strange way, it really grounded me in not optimism, but like this sort of physical reality of the problem. And that when you avoid emitting some greenhouse gases, you're doing some good. If you can avoid it in a way that's like focused on justice and equity and not recreating pre-existing problems in society, particularly towards like non-white countries and indigenous peoples, then that's also very good, if you can do that. That unfortunately does not feature very strongly in the IPCC report, which is a significant problem, which we can get into in another podcast.
Thank you so much, Ketan, and we wish you all the best for your paternity leave. Far more important project than all of this.
Thank you.
Thanks to Ketan Joshi for sharing his thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in. and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. We have more information about all our guests and their work in the episode show notes on darkandlight.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at darkandlightzine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.